In 1898, the U.S. government, under President McKinley, with Theodore Roosevelt, the agitating, second-in-effective command, of the Department of the U.S. Navy, blew up their own battle cruiser, the USS Maine, in Cuba's Havana Harbor, to seize Cuba from Spain, including Guantanamo Bay, until present day. We have just finished paying international, telephone taxes, on this short war, between the U.S. and Spain. Cuba had long been a colonial possession of Imperial Spain, yet the newly expanding United States desired Cuba to fall under their sphere of influence, and hence, Theodore Roosevelt sent the battlecruiser, the USS Maine, to Havana Harbor, Cuba, to supposedly protect U.S. assets. Shortly after arriving, the battlecruiser USS Maine exploded, supposedly from a Spanish naval mine set loose nearby in the harbor. The U.S., under the exhortation of media magnate, William Randolph Hearst's infamous propagandistic Yellow Press, immediately declared war, and with the personal combat participation of Theodore Roosevelt, took Cuba from Spain as a new colonial possession. Hearst personally oversaw the illegalization of marijuana later in the century and the first war on drugs to justify J. Edgar Hoover's Federal Bureau of Investigation. Hearst lobbied against marijuana to ensure cheap but devastating paper, timber supplies for his newspaper empire, which used dioxin bleaching, for his Yellow Press. The term Rosebud, a lost child sled in Orson Welles' Citizen Kane, which depicts Hearst, is supposedly the nickname Hearst gave to his wife's cunt. Hearst's influence reached even into the late 1970s when San Francisco punk band, the Dead Kennedys, was stopped by the Hearst family from publishing a record called Kidnapped about granddaughter, Patty Hearst, when she joined the Symbionese Liberation Army, urban terrorists who robbed American banks. With the end of the Spanish-American War at the turn of the 20th century, Theodore Roosevelt, a Bohemian Grove member, then went on to become president, after Ambrose Bierce, a fellow Bohemian Grove poet, incited McKinley to be shot by Cole Goltz, to implicate the famous anarchist, Emma Goldman. At the same time, Wall Street was small, and had just been set up, and the Jewish financier, Jacob Schiff, lends the Japanese a huge sum to smash the Russians without warning at Port Arthur in 1904. Schiff gave them the loan as the Russian Tsar was oppressing Eastern Russian Jews in pogroms. The sum was enormous in its day, and risky. Everybody knew the Russians, no one knew the Japanese. Yet, Schiff saw it as an opportunity to bloody the Russians' nose for committing pogroms at the turn of a supposedly enlightened 20th century. The Japanese Naval Task Force, built, and armed, with the Schiff, Wall Street loan, attacked the Russians at their western warm water harbor of Port Arthur with complete surprise in an undeclared raid, destroying them utterly and sparking a Japanese armament program into the 30s and beyond. The Japanese demanded huge reparations and territory from the tottering Tsar and repaid their loans, and this ensured Wall Street became the new financial center, overtaking London's stock exchange and paving the way for an American century. It also set the Japanese on a path of naval superiority through undeclared, surprise attack at dawn. The Japanese continued to be aggressive all the way through the 1910s, seizing German territory in the Shandong and harassing Chinese assets. Meanwhile, men like Averell Harriman and Prescott Bush were funding the steel baron, Fritz Thyssen, who is, in turn, giving funds to Adolf Hitler. In the Pacific, ordinary civilians in Australia were terrified of the Japanese expansion and aggression throughout the 1930s. The Japanese army was marauding in China from the 1930s onwards, parallel to the Nazi rise in 1933, in Europe. It was only a matter of time until the Japanese would strike southwards and eastwards as well as deeper into China. The Japanese Army Command wanted China and then India. The Imperial Japanese Navy and Air Force wanted Southeast Asia and Australia. Meanwhile, the man who was later to be cast by Ian Fleming, as the real-life James Bond, and perhaps the most important double agent of the Second World War, a man named Dusko Popov, codenamed Tricycle, was gathering information on the Axis. He not only offered but warned J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, corrupt and a cross-dresser, the fact that the Japanese were to strike at Pearl Harbor in the month of December, 1941, 6 months before, in a FBI meeting in the U.S. He was thrown out of Hoover's FBI office rudely. The British, under Prime Minister Winston Churchill, also knew through other spying channels. He said nothing. Churchill later said he had never had a better night's sleep, knowing that the U.S. would be drawn into the European conflict by the attack on Pearl Harbor in the Pacific by the Japanese Imperial Navy and Air Force. The Japanese had a long technology in aircraft carriers, had struck first at Port Arthur against the Tsarist Russians. The Japanese went on to become a marauding power. The League of Nations did nothing to prevent the Japanese. Yet, the U.S. knew the expanding Japanese would strike as the U.S. was embargoing the Japanese supplies of aviation fuel. The Japanese needed raw materials that could only be found through the conquest of Southeast Asia. The U.S. intended on provoking a Japanese attack. Prescott Bush's family friend, William Stamps Farish I, sold the aviation gas to the Japanese needed to reach Pearl Harbor, as the Japanese were embargoed by the provoking U.S. His grandson, Stamps Farish III, currently blind, trusts Bush family banks. Today, U.S. Navy pilot, G.H.W. Bush, was shot down twice in the Pacific, and even though subs were in short supply, U.S. High Command always managed to retrieve him. George H.W. Bush lost 2 gunners. Fellow aircrew called him Shaky Bush, and did not want to risk flying with him. Franklin Delano Roosevelt attempted to provoke a Japanese air attack at the Philippines, but feared losing too many cruisers, and so withdrew them. This is why the ships were at rest. This is why the radar was turned off. This is why no one reacted. This is why the 2 aircraft carriers that they needed to win the war were withdrawn from Pearl before the attack. Remember the Maine. Remember Pearl Harbor. Remember 9/11.
Now believe, flame, which hither ye have fought from regions where I reign. Ye fools and priests, I spit upon your fire.